How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. It's an interesting day on the calendar. I think it's the only date on the calendar that is not based on the Hebrew year. It's actually based on the solar year. And that's where we make a slight adjustment in the Amidah, also known as the Shemona Esrei, or in the Talmud, it's simply called the prayer, the central prayer that we say, or at least men are obligated to say, morning, afternoon, and evening. And we pray for God's blessings. We make a little shift from saying God who grants blessing to God who grants the dew and rain for a blessing. And we start saying that either on December 4th or December 5th every year because it is tied to the winter solstice, not, to the Hebrew calendar, which shifts quite a bit from year to year based on, with reference to the solar calendar. But tonight is when we started saying Talu Matar Livracha in the Amidah. So there you go. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our own Lucy in Minnesota, Lucy Johnson. Beautiful. Thank you for this dedication in honor of Sal and Nina for their talented and inspired teaching of the Talmud, so even beginners like me get to learn a bit. Lucy, it's so great having you in the class among all our regulars. It inspires me so much. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say Amen. Forgot to ask, who's in the house? Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lucy in Minnesota, so glad you're here, Yosef in Englewood, Shandora in the Bronx, Lorraine in Texas, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Stephen in New Hampshire, Bill in Mid-Missouri. Wait, it skipped on me. Stephen in New Hampshire, Leona in Illinois, Bill in Missouri, and Melissa with a big amen. Also Spencer in Connecticut, Ella in Southern California, Alan in New York City, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. They did schedule, and if I mentioned it yesterday, Miami Jewish Film Festival. We're playing Guns N' Moses playing at the Miami Jewish Film Festival 2 nights. January 15th and 16th. So if you're anywhere near Miami, would love to see you there. Mark your calendars, Guns N' Moses, January 15th and 16th in Miami. And the 16th, the Thursday night, is the bigger venue. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Hope to see you there. Okay. Our daf tonight is page 163 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our journey through chapter 10, the final chapter, and our discussion of Mishnah number 1. The sages being very wary of all the potential cheaters out there and dictating how, at least to the limits of the technology that they had 2,000 years ago, how they would ensure that documents were not forged. What is going on here? Hold on a second. Let me just reload the YouTube feed. Is it going? Yeah, it's going. Okay. Okay, so we picked this up at the bottom of page 162b. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Is it okay on YouTube? My YouTube is stuck. I just hope it's all right and people are getting it if they're watching on YouTube. Although Facebook looks fine. So hopefully it's okay. All right. Where am I? Okay, bottom of page 162b. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to the gap of 2 blank lines between the text and the signatures, which the sages said invalidates the document. Does this refer to the size of lines with the space between the lines added, Or is it perhaps referring to the lines of writing themselves without their space, right? So the simple idea here is that when a legal document was written, if there was more than one line, one blank line between the end of the text of that legal document and where the witnesses signed their names, it would invalidate the document because there was too much space in there, and it would be possible for the holder of the document to add some material that would somehow, benefit him and would be forged. So they made sure that there wasn't room for that. So one line, okay. 2 lines is too much. Now that you're saying 2 lines is going to invalidate it, but 1 line is okay. All right, but what are we talking about? Are we talking about the line where the actual handwritten text would appear? What about the spaces between the lines? That's what they're asking. I'm very distracted by that frozen YouTube screen. I really hope it's coming through okay. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, it stands to reason that it is referring to the lines with their spaces. You need the lines and their spaces. As if it were to enter your mind that it is referring to the lines without their spaces. For what is one line without its space fit? The Baraisa did not have to state that a document with a single blank line after the text measured without counting spaces is not forgeable. This is obvious. Rather, one may conclude from this claim that the reference is to 2 lines with their spaces. And the Gemara affirms, conclude from this claim that it is so. Rabbi Shabtai says in the name of Chizkiah, with regard to the gap of 2 blank lines between the text and the signatures, which the sages said invalidates the document, the lines are measured by the handwriting of witnesses and not by the handwriting of a scribe, who is presumably skilled enough to write in a smaller script. So what is the reason for this? Well, anyone who forges a document, adding additional lines of text to the document, would not go to a scribe and ask him to forge it. The forger would execute, this fraudster would execute the forgery himself. Or he would have some other unscrupulous person who is not a professional scribe forge it. Meaning it's a given that you're not going to find a professional scribe who would forge a document and thereby risk his reputation and ruin his career. Scribes were inherently honest people, at least with regard to their profession. Therefore, in order to present a concern for possible forgery, a document must have 2 blank lines that are measured by the handwriting of an ordinary person, such as one of the witnesses. Now, the Gemara has established that the width of the gap required to invalidate the document is 2 lines with interlinear space, right? The space between the lines as well. And the Gemara clarifies this. And how much interlinear space is necessary to invalidate the document? And Rav Yitzchak Ben Elazar says, for example, enough to write the Hebrew word Lech and then the Hebrew word Lecha, this word on top of that one. I think the text is really small. This will be a little bit bigger. So where are we familiar with Lech Lecha, right? That's what God said to Abraham. He didn't just say, leave the land that you were born in, leave the land of your father's house, right? It would have been enough to say Lech. But God said Lech Lecha, one of the many times that a word is doubled for emphasis in the Torah. And often it's translated as leave, you shall surely leave, or indeed you will leave. But that doesn't begin to capture how that operates in Hebrew. And so it's often understood that, well, why was that verb doubled? Leave for yourself, leave not just physically, but leave, the broken spirituality of your father's land and go to a land that I will show you. But Lech Lecha is also said to Abraham in a very different context when God orders him to take his son Isaac, the ultimate test, and sacrifice his son, which was not only overcoming, obviously, the love of a parent. How could a parent sacrifice his child? Such a test. But also because God had told Abraham that I'm going to make you a nation and all the world will bless themselves by your descendants. And those descendants and the covenant between God and Abraham would be carried through the line of Isaac, of Yitzhak, his son. So how could now God ask him to sacrifice that son? But Abraham, who knew God personally, as it were, trusted God. And when he tells him to go sacrifice your son, he says, Lech Lecha. Right? So that's the Akedas Yitzhak, and we read that in every day. Not everybody reads it, but it's there. So where is it? Lech Lecha. V'Lech Lecha is how he says it to Abraham at the time of the Akedas Yitzhak. And you shall go, or get yourself going. Get going. Right? So let's see if we could see it. The point why we're raising it here, right there. It's all backwards for me, so here we go. V'Lech Lecha, right, with a vav, and then lamed and a final chaf, and a lamed and a final chaf. And why are we talking about that here? Because the lamed, the l of Lech, extends above the line, and the final chaf of Lech, ch, right, when it's a final letter of a word, extends below the line. And what they're saying, Lech Lecha, is convenient for this context because if a Lech and a Lecha were written one above the other, because the lamed extends above the line, you need a space above the line. Because the final chaf sofit, extends below the line, you need some space below the line. And what they're saying is that each line of text needs its own space above and below that line, because there's some Hebrew letters that have an extension upward, like the lamed, and there's some Hebrew letters that have an extension downward, like a chaf sofit, like a final chaf. And so if you happen to have one of these words above the other, where one word has an extension upward and the word above it has an extension downward, you need not just a single space between the lines, but that whole line and its own space, right? A double space between the lines because of the nature of Hebrew. Right, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Elazar says, for example, you need enough space to write the Hebrew word lech and then the Hebrew word lecha, this one on top of that one. These two words each consist of two letters, a lamed and a final chaf. And the former has a projection that fully occupies the interlinear space above it, and the latter has a projection that fully occupies the interlinear space below it. And writing these words one under the other, then, would require an additional interlinear space above and below both lines. And the Gemara concludes, so apparently, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar maintains that the empty space required to invalidate the document is the width of 2 written lines and 4 interlinear spaces, right? Interlinear gaps between the lines, because you need a full gap below the line and above the line, and then you can't use the one below the line to be the space above the next line. Each line needs its own interlinear space above and below. Rav Chiya bar Ami states a different opinion in the name of Ula. For example, enough to write a lamed on the upper line and the final chaf on the lower line. And so the Gemara concludes, so apparently Ula maintains that the empty space required to invalidate the document is the width of 2 written lines with 3 interlinear spaces. He's going to figure, well, they don't always going to line up exactly that the chaf, of the line above and the lamed line below are going to run into each other. They can be offset just a little bit. And so the interlinear space between the lines doesn't need to be doubled. Rabbi Abahu states a different opinion. For example, enough to write the name Baruch ben Levi on one line. So Baruch has that final chaf, and Levi starts with that lamed. And therefore, the Gemara concludes, so apparently Rabbi Abahu maintains that the empty space required to invalidate the document is the width of 1 written line, and its 2 interlinear spaces, one above and one below. And if you have more than even that amount is enough to invalidate the document, because forgery could go on in that empty space that was left between the end of the contractual text, the text of the contract, and where the witnesses signed it. New concept. Rav says they taught in the Baraisa that a gap of 2 lines invalidates the document only if that space is between the witnesses' signatures and the text of the document, as we've been discussing. But if there is a gap between the witnesses' signatures and a court's ratification of the document, which follows the witnesses' signatures, then even if there is more than the space like this, even if there's more than 2 blank lines, the document is valid. We're not going to be concerned that there's a big space of empty paper between the witnesses' signatures and the ratification of the court, the way we would be if that space was between the end of the text of the contract and the witnesses' signatures. And the Gemara asks, well, what is different about the case where the gap is between the witnesses and the text that invalidates the document, and what is different about the gap that's between the signatures of the witnesses and the ratification of the court where it does not invalidate the document? Why are these different? What is different? Yeah, and there is a concern that perhaps the holder of the document may forge additional lines and write whatever he wants. And the witnesses have already signed at the bottom, giving the appearance that they attest to the added lines as well. But the same concern can be raised concerning a gap between the witnesses' signatures and the court's ratification. There too, he could forge additional lines and write whatever he wants and have witnesses sign it, with the court's ratification giving the appearance that it attests to the added lines and signatures as well. Why is this document valid, right? If you had a big space between the contract where there was this text followed immediately by the witnesses' signatures, then a big blank page, and then at the bottom the ratification of the court, well, maybe in that big blank space he could write a whole new set of terms that would really change the contract and just have witnesses sign the added terms, and then it would seem that the court ratified the whole document with these 2 sets of text and 2 sets of witnesses. So why would we make this? So why would we say that that space does not invalidate? And the Gemara explains, when is a gap between the witnesses' signatures and the court ratification not problematic, according to Rav? Only when someone inks in the blank space with lines or dots to prevent information from being added there. So your concern is a valid concern that somebody could add terms and more witness signatures there. But they can't because we just make some squiggles there. We write in some, filler text so that there's not the possibility of adding something there. And only then would we say that a space does not invalidate the document. And so then the Gemara asks, well, if that's so, then the gap between the witnesses' signatures and the text of the document should also be made irrelevant in this manner. Why say that 2 lines invalidates if we could just fill it in with squiggles? Let the scribe ink in that space too. Why then was it taught categorically that the witnesses must sign within 2 lines of the text? And the Gemara answers, inking in the gap between the text of the contract and the signatures of the witnesses will not help, as people might say, i.e. the concern might be raised, that the witnesses are signed only on the inking in, meaning it is possible that the witnesses' signatures were affixed only to attest that the inking in was done in their presence, and that the inking in is not a sign of duplicity, and their signatures do not relate to the actual text of the document. Well, the Gemara says, then if that's so, raise the same concern when the gap between the witnesses' signatures and the court ratification is inked in. There too, people might say that the court's ratification is signed only for the inking in of those squiggles and not for the actual text of the document. And the Gemara answers, a court does not sign on mere inking in. Their ratification is always in reference to the entire document. Now the Gemara raises another issue. And let there be a concern that perhaps the holder of the document will excise, cut off, the entire text that appears above the signatures, and then erase the inked in part and write whatever he wants in that erased area and have unscrupulous witnesses sign it. And this would be a valid document. as Rav says, a document that comes before the court for ratification, in which its content and the signatures of its witnesses are both written over an erasure, is valid. And the court ratification would then be assumed to be referring to this new forged document. In other words, a court may ratify a document where it's clear that the whole document had some other document written on it, it was erased, and then they wrote a new document and signed that. Well, if that's the case, maybe they had a document that was on a long piece of paper, and what did he do? He just came and he cut off the top. They had inked in the area between the contract and the ratification of the court. So now he erases that inking in, and he writes a new contract there with unscrupulous witnesses signing it. And it would appear that the court ratified this second contract that was written in the erasure, whereas really the court had ratified some earlier contract where the top of it was cut off and the bottom of it, which was just the inking in, was erased. So how are we going to prevent that? How do we know that that didn't happen? And by the way, why would they allow, why is it that a contract can be valid if an old contract on a piece of paper was erased and then they wrote in a new one? Wouldn't you think that that automatically disqualifies the contract? Answer, paper was pretty expensive back then. It was not so typical and easy to get. And so they might well have some kind of, lapsed contract that is no longer useful to anybody. And they don't, and they could save a little bit of money by just erasing all the ink from that and reusing the parchment, reusing the scroll. Now we're on page 163b. So how do we know that this didn't happen? And this works out well, i.e. this concern would not apply, according to Rav Kahana, who teaches in the name of Shmuel that a document in which its content and its witnesses' signatures are both written over an erasure is valid. According to him, all would be well. Meaning, it would not be well in the scenario that we're painting, but he would allow that. It is Rav who says that an inked-in gap between the witnesses' signatures and the court's ratification is acceptable, and it is Shmuel who says that a document that is written and signed over an erasure is acceptable. But according to Rav Tavyume, who teaches this latter statement in the name of Rav, then what can be said? According to him, Rav said both statements, and taken together they pose a difficulty. The inked-in gap between the witnesses' signatures and the ratification can easily be erased, and a new document with signatures can be written over the erasure, as we just said. So, how do we protect against that? And the Gemara answers, Rav maintains that in all cases like this, where a document and its witnesses' signatures are written over an erasure, and there is a court ratification on the non-erased part of the document, so then the later court ratifies the document not on the basis of the previous court's ratification that is on it, but only on the basis of the signatures of the witnesses that are on it. In other words, if they get a contract where the whole contract is written over an erased part, but the ratification of the court is written on an unerased part of the paper, they ignore the ratification of the court. They listen to this concern and say, well, it's possible that the court ratified the old document, not this new document. So this is considered an unratified document, and a new court will have to ratify it. And then they will bring in the witnesses who are signed on and ask them, did you sign this? Is this the text that you witnessed? They would ratify it anew. Now, the Gemara cites another opinion. And Rabbi Yochanan says, they taught in the Baraisa that a gap of one line does not invalidate the document, only in the case where that space is between the witnesses' signatures and the text of the document. But if the gap is between the witnesses' signatures and the court's ratification of the document, then a space of even one line renders the document not valid. This is a completely different ruling. Right? Before we said, well, if it's one line between the text and the signatures, that's okay. 2 lines invalidates. But space between the witnesses' signatures and the ratification of the court, that can be a big space. We're not concerned. Rabbi Yochanan says, between the witnesses' signatures and the ratification of the court, no space. Even one line would invalidate this document and render it at least unratified. That's according to Rabbi Yochanan. Now the Gemara asks, what is different about the case where there is a one-line gap between the witnesses' signatures and the court's ratification that you would say it's not valid? You allow one space between the text and the signatures of the witnesses. Why do you not allow not even one space between the signatures and the ratification of the court? And the Gemara answers, there is a concern that perhaps the holder of the document will excise the entire text of the document at the top of the paper and then write a new brief document with its text and the signatures of its witnesses all on one line. And the court's ratification will appear to verify the new forged document. And Rabbi Yochanan holds that a document that comes before the court with its text and the signatures of its witnesses appearing all on one line is valid. That's a short contract. Like, I sold you this donkey. And, John and Tom both signed it. All in one line. That's a valid contract. Pretty ambiguous. The terms of the whole contract fit in one line, but we're not going to say that it's too short to be a contract. If that's what the parties agreed to, that's what they agreed to. We're not going to say it's invalidated just because it's a one-line contract where the text of the contract and the witnesses' signatures all fit on one line. It could still be a contract. I'm almost done. Questions or comments? Get them in now. Wow, that was quick. Wait a minute. Oh, no. I'm not done. I'm not so close to done. I skipped a page. Okay. It all can be a contract of one line is valid. Now, the Gemara suggests, if so, the same problem also exists when there is a one-line gap between the witnesses' signatures and the text. We should have the same concern that perhaps he will cut off the whole contract above and then write whatever he wants in a brief one-line document. And the witnesses' signatures on the next line, which are from the old document, will still be signed there, and it will appear that they are attesting to the veracity of the new forged one-line document. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan holds that a document that comes before the court with its text on one line and the signatures of its witnesses appearing on another line, i.e. on the following line, that is not valid. Right? That's kind of, really? So if it's a one-line contract and the witness is signed on that same line, it can be a valid contract. But if it's a one-line contract and the signatures of the witnesses are on the next line, not a valid contract. Why? The Gemara suggests, and let there be a concern that perhaps, wait, let's just read that note. The Rashbam explains that this is for the same reason as the requirement to review the content of a document in the last line of the document. No new details may be learned from the final line of a document due to the possibility of falsification by excising the original text and writing a one-line text in the gap. You can't, so if it's a one-line contract, okay, there's no new information in the last line because there is no last line. But if it's a two-line contract, the text on one line, the signatures on the next, then there is a last line. There's important information on the last line, namely the signatures of the witnesses. We would have to disregard the last line for the same reason we said yesterday. Therefore, it'd be equivalent to an unwitnessed contract, and that's why it's no good. Now, the Gemara suggests, and let there be a concern that perhaps the holder of the document will cut the entire document, leaving only the blank line and the signatures that follow it, and he will write a brief document in which its text and its signatures of its witnesses are on one line, followed by the original signatures that remain from the original document. And he will say, I did this in order to increase the number of witnesses, right? Okay, I had extra witnesses. You can disregard them, but it is still a one-line contract with the text and my witnesses on the same line. And then it would be forgeable. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan maintains that in all cases like this, where a document and its witnesses' signatures are written on one line, followed by other signatures on subsequent lines, the court ratifies the document not on the basis of the signatures of the witnesses that are at the bottom, but on the basis of the signatures of the witnesses that are on top, on the same line as the text. Therefore, the forging of a document in this manner is impossible. All you've done is write a new contract. You're going to have to bring those witnesses in. If you sought to forge, new lines above these other witnesses and use them as witnesses, that's not going to work because those witnesses are disregarded. All you've done is try to create a new contract, and you're going to have to prove it in court that it's real. New subject. Having cited Rav's statement, the Gemara discusses the matter itself. Rav says, a document that comes before the court in which its content and the signatures of its witnesses are both written over an erasure is valid. You can erase a whole contract, write a new contract with new witnesses, and you can do that because paper was expensive. Now 164a. And if you say there is a possibility of forgery with such a document, as the holder of the document can erase the original writing on the paper, then write the text of the document and have witnesses sign on the part that had been erased, and then erase the document text again, substituting for it a text that is more to his advantage, leaving the original signatures in place, or let's say the second set of signatures in place, but now matched to a third text. Well, this is not a valid argument. Paper that has been erased once is not similar in appearance to paper that has been erased twice. It will be seen that the signatures are on a place that was erased once, and that the text is written on a place that had been erased twice, and the forgery will be noticed. Gemara suggests, but let there be a concern that perhaps the holder of the document will initially, after the entire original document, including the signatures, has been erased, but before the second one is written, throw some ink on the place where the witnesses are to sign under the text of the second document, and then erase that ink. And he will do this so that when, after the witnesses have signed, he then erases the document text and writes a false text. And it will emerge that both this, the new document's text, and that, the signatures, will be on paper that had been erased twice. And Abaye said in response to this, Rav holds that witnesses may not sign a document written over an erasure unless the paper was erased in their presence, i.e. unless they saw the paper after its old text had been erased and before the new text was written. They will then see that the place where they are to sign has been erased twice, while the place where the document is to be written has been erased only once. Then they will realize that this leaves open an opportunity of subsequent erasing and falsification, and they will refrain from signing. You know, I'll just mention, I'm thinking as I'm reading this, my daughter is teaching Hebrew school. It's a part-time job for her while she's in school. And she's teaching some, young kids. And this week's Torah portion, we have Jacob, right, tricking his father to get the blessing. And then heading out and having to deal with his very corrupt uncle, and being tricky there. In the whole matter of making a deal with his uncle who keeps trying to rip him off and change his wages, etc. And Jacob makes a deal that, listen, we'll just separate the flocks, and any goats, that are born to the spotted or speckled goats will be mine, and the ones that aren't spotted or speckled will be yours. And that's the minority that have that pattern. So the uncle says, sure, no problem. And then they start reproducing more in his favor, either because of the blessing of God or because Jacob knew something. But especially in the way that Jacob tricks his father, who's blind, into getting the blessing. And we're like, what kind of an origin tale is that for our people? We're the children of Israel, and Israel himself lied to his father in order to get a blessing that he's transmitted to us, his children, for all these generations. It's very hard to understand that, and particularly, how do you teach that to kids? But I'm thinking here, look at the sages who are obviously tzaddikim, right? They are saints. They are the most upright people, morally upright people. And what are they doing here? Page after page, they are using their imagination to say, how do we prevent fraud, right? Well, we can't be Pollyannish and say that we're so pure that we're not going to imagine fraud. We don't want that to run through our pure minds. Because if they do that, they're going to leave, our people unprotected. As our leaders, they actually have to understand and imagine the corruption of our enemies, or even our enemy within, of people that might, even people in our community that might commit fraud. They have to anticipate how fraud would be committed. right? And that's why our sages also explained to us that although the Torah is quite terse and doesn't say explicitly, just how wicked Esau and Lavan were, our tradition, does. Our tradition really tells us, and it sort of fills in the gaps a little bit about how these unsavory characters in the Torah were acting with their family members and in their community. And they were wicked people. So Jacob, in order to get the blessing from Yitzhak was innocent in this, but Yitzhak had been seduced, so to speak, by the prevarication, by the lies of Esau, who was pretending to be something to his father that he wasn't. Right? And Rebecca could see that Esau was sort of, pulling the wool over Yitzhak's eyes, so to speak. That's why Jacob had to don the wool on his arms. But this idea that, we don't live in heaven, right? We live in this world. And in this world, there are wicked people all around. And you have to protect yourself, right? That old play, Other People's Money, right? That they said lawyers are like nuclear weapons. The other side has theirs, so you have to have yours. And this idea that people will, at the lowest level, they're murdering psychopaths. But even levels above that, where they're not just obvious evil psychopaths, but they're people who will take advantage, and there are many people who will take advantage of us. And even as we're here and struggling to do the right thing all the time, we have to be aware that there are people out there who will take advantage of us, and you've got to use your imagination and your sechel, your God-given intelligence to anticipate, how people out there could conduct themselves. You got to protect yourself, right? You got to protect yourself, and that's what this is all about: sort of predicting and preempting how people might take advantage. Okay. Right, that they would refrain from signing. Okay, the Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rav from a Baraisa. A document in which its text is on part of the paper that has never had writing erased, and the signatures of its witnesses are on an erasure, is valid. And the Gemara suggests, but let us be concerned that perhaps the holder of the document will erase the text and write in its place whatever he wants, and it will then be a document where both its text and the signatures of its witnesses are on an erasure. Since Rav maintains that such a document is valid, it is easily forgeable in this manner. And the Gemara answers, in other words, the witnesses wouldn't object because there are documents where the witnesses are on an unerased part and the text is on an erased part. And the Gemara answers, such a document is valid only in a case where the witnesses write this. They would say, we the witnesses signed on an erasure, but the document text was written on a part of the paper that never had writing erased. If the holder of the document then tries to erase the original text and write the new text in its place, the forgery will be noticed. And the Gemara asks, well, where do the witnesses write such a declaration? If they write it underneath their signatures, the holder of the document can simply cut it off. And if they write it above their signatures, the holder of the document can erase it along with the text of the document. And the Gemara answers, they write the declaration between the signature of one witness and the signature of the other witness on the same line. The Gemara asks, if that is so, that the Baraisa is discussing a case in which the witnesses write a declaration about the circumstances of the document's condition, will then say that the latter clause of the Baraisa, where it said a document in which its text is on an erasure and the signatures of its witnesses are on a part of the paper that had never been erased, would not be valid. And the Gemara presents its question, why is such a document not valid? Here too, let the witnesses write this. We, the witnesses, signed on a paper that never had it writing erased, but the document text was written on a part that was erased. Now, in this case as well, it should be valid. As what can you say to argue that it is a forgeable document? If you say that the holder of the document, having erased the original document, can erase the writing once again and write a new false document, well, this should not be a concern, as didn't you say that a paper that has been erased once is not similar in appearance to a paper that has been erased twice? Now that you made that argument, we're testing it. It would therefore be noticeable that the document had been erased a second time, and the forgery would be noticeable. And the Gemara answers that statement applies only when the witnesses are signed on an erasure, and the appearance of that erasure can be compared with the appearance of a double erasure. But in a case where the witnesses are signed not on an erasure, but on paper that has not had its writing erased, so that there is no contrast between a single erasure and a double erasure, the forgery would not be known, and that's why we're concerned. So the Gemara suggests, but let the court bring another parchment, write something on it, and erase it, and then compare the single erasure with the erasure on the document in question. And if the document were erased twice, the contrast would be seen between a single erasure and a double erasure. And the Gemara answers, the erasure of this parchment is not necessarily similar to the erasure of that parchment. Right? Parchment is made from an animal skin. They don't all behave exactly the same way. It's not like the regular 20-pound paper from Staples where every sheet is the same. A single erasure on one parchment might resemble a double erasure on a different parchment. Now I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. And let me reload that document. Bum, bum, bum. Okay. So the Gemara continues to suggest, but let us accept, i.e., verify the signatures of the witnesses on the document in court, after which they may safely be erased, and then erase the signatures and compare the erasure to the erasure of the document text to see if it was erased once or twice. And in response to this question, Rav Hoshaya says that which is erased on the same day that it was written is not necessarily similar to that which was erased 2 days ago, i.e. more than a day after it was written. An older erasure looks different from a new one. So the comparison might not show that there was a double erasure in the document. And the Gemara suggests, but let us retain the document for an extra day, at which point both erasures will be old and they could be compared. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said in response, we are concerned for the possibility of an erring court, a court that makes an error. If such complicated procedures were used in order to declare a document valid, there would be a chance that a particular court would not apply them properly, and that court would end up ratifying a document that was not valid, right? We need reproducible tests that can travel from court to court, as it were. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll continue tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay, a few questions. Bill, question. Because we've been talking about lines of space the last couple of dafs, the last couple of pages, how big is a line? Is there a standard size of letters? What if you have a scribe who habitually writes very small or very large? You probably asked that before they said, we follow the size line according to one of the witness signatures and not according to scribes, because scribes are so skilled and they can be very regular, but some are bigger, some are smaller, and a good scribe could go as small as he wants. And so we are doing some kind of reasonable man standard, a regular civilian standard. Bill says, it's a given that you're not going to find a professional scribe who will engage in this forgery. To borrow the Gemara's own language, is that so? We all know horror stories of members of otherwise honorable professions who broke their professional codes of ethics because they thought they could get away with it. I was thinking the same. But they say no. They say no, and they live then and we live now. I guess what they would say is very unlikely, and in order to prove such a thing, you would have the burden of proof. The assumption is that a scribe would not do that. They've told us that. The assumption is a scribe would not do that. Now, that doesn't mean it never happened. But to overcome that presumption, you'd have the burden of proof. Sharon, scrolls were well known to be reused due to the scarcity of parchment. The Cairo Geniza revealed this. Thank you very much. Very good. Bill, responding to Sharon, indeed, they were so commonly reused that there's a specific word, palimpsest. I hope I haven't butchered that. Palimpsest, for a parchment that has been erased and rewritten. What a great word, palimpsest. Got to remember that for the spelling bee puzzle that I often do. Okay, and finally, Lucy, who sponsored today's show. Thank you so much, Lucy. And if you'd like to sponsor one of our episodes of AT Daily, this is the time to do it. We're in our annual campaign. We really need your help. We are a nonprofit. We want to light up the world with Jewish wisdom, and all our expenses have gone up. So if somebody hasn't donated yet, this is a great time. donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, Lucy says, maybe also the sages saw ways that people tried to defraud, altering deeds, etc., and use their experience as well as their imagination. For sure. Absolutely for sure. I think maybe a lot of this was let us be concerned that, but we haven't seen an incident occur, right? They're just bringing it up as a possibility, but I'm sure that in these discussions, either they saw it as a judge or they heard from another judge who saw it. So I'm sure that many times it was from experience, but I think also from the imagination, let us be concerned. And they were really thinking, well, if I had to act as a forger, how would I forge? And they do that for holy purposes. Likewise, we see in other places that the sages had to be familiar with avodah zarah. They had to know what idolatry was. Not just generally speaking, but they actually had to study avodah zarah. They had to study what other religions, what idolatrous religions, what their practices were, so that they could judge, was somebody practicing avodah zarah or not. They had to study demonology in case they ever had to deal with demons. There's a lot of demonology in the Babylonian Talmud. Not because they were in any way attracted to demons, but because it was their job to know basically about everything under the sun, right? And we see that the Talmud touches on everything, from going to the bathroom to bringing sacrifices in the Holy Temple. It just touches on every aspect of life. So they had to know it. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, see you tomorrow, Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night. I'll just mention, in case anyone's wondering, I always do it like this because it's a tradition. We don't blow out a candle. We do this.